Hello, U.S. history students. Hey, hopefully everybody's doing pretty good. This is a PowerPoint on World War II. It's going to cover some things that you guys will be dealing with for the rest of this week and next week. We're going to do some things today where you guys are going to utilize a lot of things I mentioned in the PowerPoint as well as on a reading I'm going to give you to answer some questions that you guys will turn in for some points. My goal is to kind of get us through World War II hopefully by Tuesday to where you guys are going to do a movie project. So hopefully everyone has access to some type of Dish, Netflix, you name it. I know we all have access to something, YouTube, where you guys can watch some things that we're going to be doing a project with starting next week. So anyway, I'll explain that a little bit more later this week. Let's kind of get through here. So on this PowerPoint, I'm just going to kind of highlight some things. I'm not going to go through every little bit, okay? Some of these things will come up again, like I said, and some other things that we're going to do. So hopefully you kind of get a little bit of information now, and then you get a little bit more later. All right, so let's go ahead and make this large. World War II. Uh, After World War One, we all know there was a Great Depression during the late 1920s, 1930s. All these countries are going through such a turmoil economically. Period. It doesn't even the U.S. We're all having something to deal with. So as we get to, we know Hitler's in power. You have Mussolini in power in Italy. So you have all these different tyrannical leaders, but the people are drawn to them because of what they're trying to do for their countries and stabilize the economies. So Hitler, who has this what they call the Deutschland, Lebensraum, living space, which means living space for Germans. Basically, that idea he wants to try to push, and he's slowly kind of pushing the envelope to see if anyone's going to react, as we talked about earlier last week. Okay, so you guys, the aggressive dictators that were coming to power. We talked about the little things they started to do. Italy will invade Ethiopia. All these things are now beginning to take place that will eventually lead us into World War II. So, democracy is something that the U.S. wants to hold on to, as well as some of the other European countries like Britain. Many are being a little bit tested as far as do they really want democracy in Europe. Some of them are slowly looking at, okay, maybe communism and socialism is going to be a better fit for us. But the Western countries see this as like, oh, an evil. Nobody wants communism. That's something that the Russians are doing. That is terrible. We're not going to do that. So the American economy began to re-gear itself. As the war begins to start by 1938, full blown in 1939, the US, actually, our economy begins to spark up because now we have what is called the Lend Lease Act, where we are basically lending money to Britain and France again. So you can imagine that kind of pulls in the war the first time. It's going to kind of pull us in the war again the second time. All right, so what pulls us into war? So there's a lot of things going on before we even get to the war that we're going to be in. The war is being fought in Europe, parts of Africa in World War II. The U.S. at this point in time, we're just kind of aiding, okay, aiding, sending money, sending military equipment, things like that. That's what our role is, and it's actually boosting our economy because now we're putting people back to work. We're now creating all these new tanks, new planes, putting women back to work, bringing people back into these industries that we once were in during World War I. So our leader FDR, who was our president at this time, Pearl Harbor is what pulls us into the war. So when you guys did your task reading, the Japanese who were on our side during World War One are now on the Axis side. Okay, they're not on our side this time. And part of that is because, which is why you're going to see Italy and Japan on the opposite side of World War II, unlike where they were in World War One, is because neither one of them kind of got what they thought they were going to get in World War One. So they're like, bump this. I didn't get any more land. I didn't get anything out of this. So I'm going to move on to the other side, basically. So, but of course, they both have these tyrannical leaders. And of course, they want more. So, in order to get more, they're going to invade other countries. So, you have Japan that is slowly going into China, Italy attacking Ethiopia, and then trying to go into other places as well. And of course, Hitler's doing his thing in Europe. He's invading, as you guys mentioned, going back through Poland. He'll finally go through Czechoslovakia and other countries, and that's what's going to eventually cause the war to begin. So, what pulls us in after 2 years is when Japan begins to bomb Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This is when FDR finally says to Congress, "Hey, I need the rights to go ahead and do this." They're all on board. Germany and Italy declare war on us. And as you will see, we will finally be in World War II. All right, so we have what is called the War Powers Act. Be familiar with that. Establish a precedent for executive authority. So the president can reorganize federal government and create new agencies as needed. Now, this is kind of key because some of these agencies, the growth of these agencies that start off in World War II, you will see they will continue to be something to be reckoned with even in today's society. So this gives certain parts of the executive powers that they never had before. So, for example, censor all news and information. Okay. Um, Civil liberties can be taken away. They can siege property. So one of the things we're going to be talking about too is remember we have all these people in the U.S. just like World War I, how we had Germans, even though we were fighting the Germans, made it very difficult for us to make a move, make decisions because we had people who we thought may be loyal to those countries, but we didn't do anything to the Germans. We didn't do anything to those that were on the other side that lived in our country until World War II. So now that we're dealing with the Japanese Americans, we begin to feel, or should I say, the U.S. begins to feel they're a threat, even though they are citizens, just like we had German citizens during World War I. So you can see there's a little bit of a hypocrisy there. So let's kind of move on here. When the executive makes these new agencies, we have what is called the new alphabet soup agency. And we call them that because they're kind of like these agencies for all these little bitty different things that they're going to now control. So you have the Office of War Information. They control propaganda, so they're actually ones that's kind of marketing what you should know about the war, why you should support it. I'll definitely kind of show you guys some more propaganda pictures later. Other agencies control resources, labor, mobilize civilians, and military services. So you can see the FBI budget will go up from 6 million to 16 million. And World War II is a war that has fought with many spies. So that's kind of the reason why this budget is going up. We're trying to figure out who can we trust, who's in our country getting our information, working with our engineers or chemists, and trying to find out what we're doing, and then send information back to other countries. So we are definitely concerned. Yeah, the Attorney General has the okay to wiretap in case of espionage and other sabotage. And this is where we begin seeing wiretapping just take off from there all the way until we get to Watergate. So we're going to see how that plays a role too. So basically, the increase of the size of government has increased tremendously. 250 million a day to fight. You have federal employees increases from 1 million to 4 million. It's like how we have things like FEMA now that we didn't have before. 1942 election saw more Republicans in Congress. They squashed the New Deal programs now one by one. Okay, meaning that basically one by one they were getting rid of those programs. And you see that throughout our political process now. If you go back in 90s, 80s, even the last 10 years, you can see how one president comes in, he gets rid of the programs that one has created before, and then they take things a whole different direction. So that happens all the time. The thing is to outproduce our enemies. Okay, at this time, that's going to be Germany, Italy, Japan. So large industrial base, national resources, large civilian population, larger to create a large military and workforce. Because right now you still need those numbers of bodies to be present and fighting the war. By summer 1941, allocations topped 100 billion for equipment and supplies for the war effort. Factories are now beginning to run 24/7. We're putting these planes together, putting tanks together, all different types of guns, you name it. The US will outproduce Germans 2 times and the Japanese 5 times. So we are putting out all these new equipment. And keep in mind, we will find ourselves eventually fighting on two sides of war, helping the European effort in France and around Europe. And then also, we're going to find ourselves in Italy, fighting there, sending soldiers that we'll talk about soon. And then also fighting along the islands with Japan and trying to get them out of all these different places that they have now taken over. Um, California gets 10% of all federal funding. Los Angeles, second largest manufacturing region by 1944, and the South, home of 60 new military camps. All these new bases that came up, many of them came up around the 1940s. Farmers can't keep up with the demand. So now they're having to try to plant more, produce more, all that kind of stuff. And in the project, I'm going to give you guys for your assignment today. The Bracero program will be in that, so you guys can. It's just kind of a look at that. U.S. and Mexico, 1972 negotiates to send 200,000 plus short-term farm workers to the U.S. So that's part of the Bracero program. Mexican Americans led into shipbuilding, so creating a lot of jobs for them as well. The Sioux and the Navajo also led into the buildings. We will also use the Navajos for some of the, should I say, coding that we're going to use for undercover stuff. And African American workers rose to 3.8 million. All right, females grew by 50%. Again, men are going off to war, and women are back into work. 19.5 million women in workforce by 1945. The whole idea of Rosie Riveter, if you guys ever see that picture, Rosie Riveter hand up or fist up, basically on women can do this too. Okay, women can be in the workforce. We can do these jobs just as well as any man. Let's see here. Turbulence of labor. You have major strikes going on. Militant style drive. Ford Motor Company in Oregon by United Auto Workers. And you can take a look at that on your own. There's just different things that even the war is going on. It doesn't mean that people are not having issues in America. Okay, we're still having issues with workers striking. We still have problems with racism and discrimination in America. You're going to see a lot of that's going to really take off even more because if we're fighting for this country, we want equal rights. We want jobs too. We want to have the same availability to these things as anyone else. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the Zoot Suit riots. That will be in your um, packet to work on tonight, or should I say tomorrow? So the home front, when we say the home front, that means like what's happening at home in the U.S. Families rush into marriage because in some cases that was to make sure that you're the person you love can get things. If something happens to you, it goes back to someone. And this peaked in 1946. You also had high divorce rates too, because now women can go out and get jobs. I don't need you. Housing shortage, high rents, discrimination. Grow your own food. So they call that victory gardens. And you can see there's things with childcare, public health improvements. I'm gonna skip over that. Double V campaign, victory at home and abroad. So you have African American activists fight for democracy and rights at home. So this is going to kind of start to lead us into the civil rights movement, which we'll talk about after World War II. Fair housing and equal employment. At this time, they had what's called redlining, which was a legal way of keeping people of color out of certain neighborhoods. This was legal. Okay, you can't. I mean, realtors would literally say, "We cannot sell to you in this neighborhood because you are Mexican or you are black or you are Asian." They could literally do that. So that again, that was going to be a little bit more of our conversation after we finish up World War II. We'll get more into that conversation. All right, A. Philip Randolph, okay, another African American, president of Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and National Negro Congress. So definitely do a little read up on him. Prepares a rally in Washington D.C. So should I say, Martin Luther King was not the first march on Washington. You have the March on Washington movement here, the concept already happening. FDR meets with Mr. Philip Randolph and agrees to Executive Order 8802 on June 25th, 1941, bans discrimination in defense, industry, and government. So keep in mind, military is still very much segregated. Many African Americans are not able to move up to high ranks in the military during World War II as well. So I'm going to skip on. You can read the rest there. More about CORE, NAACP. These things are all going on in the home front. And they also have other riots because of that. So definitely take time to read about the violence that's taking place within the U.S. in some of these cities. Here's a poem by Langston Hughes. So kind of read that on your own. Popular culture. Spend money on vacations, resorts, country clubs, racetracks, nightclubs, dance halls, movie theaters. These are things that now people can do that are, we have electricity, we have different things that people can do to enjoy themselves and have free time off. So life is now changing. We'll be moving into more of the leisure. Book sales increase, sports increase, music, you name it. All these things are becoming a part of our lifetime. Japanese internment. The Japanese Americans were put in internment camps. That means they were taken away from their homes and put in these camps. I'll try to put up some pictures too. I do have some pictures that I took when I went to some of the internment camps in California. I also seen some in Washington. They actually kept it just as it was, where you can kind of see how the Japanese lived in these internment camps. So I'll try to share that with you at some point. Men and women in uniform. You can read more about that there. And one name to be familiar with is Douglas MacArthur. He's going to be kind of like the leader of the Pacific, sending soldiers off and what they're going to do and find the Japanese in the Pacific. So he's going to have a huge name for that area. Women's Army Corps, definitely to know that, WAC. And then the Selective Service Act bans discrimination, but there are still segregated units. African Americans and Japanese Americans are segregated. And then you have prisoners of war. So many Americans were taken as prisoners overseas. And then, of course, we were taken prisoners as well, too. And so you can take a look at the list there of the Germans versus the Japanese. And this is definitely something to know about the Japanese, how Japanese held contempt for prisoners of war. Japanese would not commit suicide, or should I say, would commit, take it back, sorry, would commit suicide rather than be captured. And this is why we have what is called the kamikaze, which was made it very difficult for us to end World War II in the Pacific because Japanese men were literally in their planes dodging down into these large barges and ships, U.S. ships, which had a lot of our tanks, a lot of our planes, and all that kind of stuff, and we're bombing into them and destroying a lot of our equipment, which made it very hard for us to get the Japanese to end the war. We couldn't beat them. Um, Even though we were making baby steps and finally getting there, but at the point we were losing so many men. And this is why we get to the point where we decide on the most difficult decision I think the U.S. ever have made was using the atomic bomb. Okay, so we'll talk about that soon. All right, so war in Europe. You have Allied offensive. There's fighting in Africa because remember the colonies that a lot of these countries control. They're fighting amongst them and bringing in soldiers there. Let's see here. There's fighting in Europe. So can I read over this here? Be familiar with the terms RAF, the Royal Air Force, which is the British Air Force, and then the Luftwaffe, which will be your German forces there. So we have the invasion in Europe. We're going to talk about some pretty big battles. We'll get to that point there too, but we're going to focus more on the battles that the U.S. is involved in. So we will focus more on the Pacific side because that's really where we kind of make a name for ourselves. Is going to be in the Pacific. And then we're also going to get to what's happening with the Jews, okay? What Germany is doing in the midst of all this war going on, how they're literally rounding up the Jews, putting them on these railroad cars, and sending them off to concentration camps. Some of them working, some of them being immediately killed in the gas chambers. Some of them being digging up their own large holes and then eventually being shot in the head and then tossed in those holes. So again, over 6 million Jews will lose their lives during this time period. So remember, we do have Russia on our side at this time. Even though they're communists, we are still working with Russia. They are helping on the European side. And then we have here finally a European victory, which we call VE Day, Victory in Europe. So September 44th, or 1944, Allies head north to free Netherlands instead of heading east, and Germany captures 6,000 Americas. So that's a loss to get to a win. And then we have also the fighting going in the Pacific. So it's almost like there's two separate fronts. The U.S. will be doing most of the fighting in the Pacific with very little help from our allies. So just to kind of make that clear. We had the invasion of the Philippines in 1941, the Peninsula, sorry. And then we have approximately 75,000 troops fighting in that region. Read the information about the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. The Battle of Coral Sea, this is the kind of the beginning of what we call um, the hopping from island to island hop. And so basically, Japan had taken all the different islands in the Pacific, even into certain parts of China, because they needed the oil basically, and the resources in order to fight this war. Because remember, Japan brought in most of their oil from the U.S. They don't have any oil on their islands, so they are basically importing that from us. And then once we cut them off at the beginning of the war, that's one of the reasons why they bombed us, because they cut us off from the oil. And then that's when they started taking over all the different islands along the Pacific coast in order to have access to those resources like oil, so they can continue to fight in the war. So take a look here at the comparison of what happens in the Battle of Midway. There was a movie just recently about that, so that's another thing I'll probably put on our list for movies. Here's another battle here. You guys can kind of read about this one. Just trying to make sure that Japan were building an air base. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal controlled the sea lines of communication between U.S. and Australia. So there was fears that after they had taken all the other islands, that they would eventually get to Australia, and that's one of the reasons why even Australians will be fighting in this war too. They would be trying to push the Japanese back along with the U.S. Some other battles here. These are not the ones I focus on too much, but you can definitely read about that. The Battle of Iwo Jima is probably one of the most important ones to be familiar with. And basically, this is where it has that famous picture of them bringing like four different men holding up the flag. And this is kind of like a way to kind of like get to boost the morale of the U.S. Like, look what we're doing. We're lifting our flag on this mountain. I believe most of those men actually get killed except for one. And then they try to figure out who was actually in that picture when it was taken. So there's films about that too. But again, we lost a lot of lives in order to take Iwo Jima. The Battle of Okinawa. Once we get to Okinawa, we are now close to Japan. And this is where we begin to make the decision Are we going to invade Japan, which will cost us hundreds and thousands of more lives, American lives? Or do we use the atomic bomb? So, this is definitely a conversation that many of our military leaders and our presidents having at this time. And of course, as you all know, we are going to use the atomic bomb. Again, because the Japanese would rather die than to basically surrender, it is making it very difficult for us to win this war because even though we're pushing them back, they keep coming back and forth with more force. So eventually, we decide to use the atomic bomb. So that's the end of that. Take your time. Remember, you can pause, look through those notes. But I just kind of want to give you guys some commentating along with the notes so you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. And now I want you guys to look at the next assignment that will be posted on Google Classroom that goes along with this as well. Have a good one.